Good morning, I'm Jenny Allen and I'm Head of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the Policy Profession Unit. Before I start, I am just going to warn you, I am having technical issues and I've dropped out about 4 times in the last 10 minutes just as we were setting up. So apologies if that happens. We'll start with some introductions and I'm just going to start with myself and then I will move around the people in the panel. And my colleague Lauren will introduce herself as well. So what you're going to hear about today is a project that isn't currently embedded in all the work of the civil service at the moment, but it really aligns with some of the key drivers in the civil service D&I strategy, the diversity and inclusion strategy, which is really focused on how we need to be establishing teams with differing perspectives from different locations. This insight is really important in terms of tackling innovation, delivering stronger policy and decision making. It's also a really important project that I'm involved with personally. So I'm on the impact board, the from Diversity to Productivity Impact Group. And it's something that I've been involved with for the last year or so, and it's really raising the bar in terms of the evidence base for D&I. I suspect lots of you on the call are really committed to diversity and inclusion or have been involved in your departments or your agencies, and we know there's a correlation between diversity and sort of organisational performance, but it's not very often been measured in this way and not very often been looked at in the multidisciplinary way that this project does. I'm just going to give a couple of house rules. So firstly, we've got Slido. Hopefully you've got the link. You can ask questions at any time in there. However, what we're going to do is wait to actually take questions and answer questions until everybody has spoken. And given that there are hundreds of you, actually there might be over 1,000 of you, really appreciate if we could just keep Slido for questions rather than comments as we go along, because we're going to lose track and then we might miss out on some really, really good questions. Okay, I think that's what I needed to say. Lauren, do you just want to and then I'll just so they know that there's somebody actually looking at those questions.
Yeah, of course. Hi, everybody. My name's Lauren and I work in Jenny's team in the Policy Profession Unit as an Equalities Advisor. I'm just here today to monitor the Slido, and as Jenny says, she's having some tech issues, so also potentially to jump in if they persist. But yes, please do use the Slido. We'd love to hear your questions and we'll be coming to those at the end.
Okay. I don't know who wants to introduce themselves first. Teresa, do you want to introduce yourself first? Then we'll just move around because you're top of my screen.
Of course. Hi, everyone. My name is Teresa Almeida. I am a Behavioural Science Research Officer at the Inclusion Initiative, which is a research centre within the Psychological and Behavioural Science Department at the London School of Economics.
Lovely. Jasmine.
Hi everyone, my name's Jasmine. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in behavioural science, again at the Inclusion Initiative, and I'll be talking to you about some of my research today.
And Daniel.
Hi everyone, I'm Daniel Jollis. I'm also a researcher at the Inclusion Initiative at London School of Economics. I'm particularly interested in behavioural science and how we can create more productive teams. So thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I'm going to get us to crack on. But while I'm still live and still here, we're going to start the session with a poll question. So hopefully that should come up for you. Yep. So just to read it out. So do you think equality, diversity and inclusion is necessary for productivity? Yes, no, or I don't know. So if people want to answer that, we'll give you a minute or so because we're slightly, we want to give you time to think and catch up. Oh, responses are coming in thick and fast. It's quite exciting to see how many people there are on the Slido. We'll just give that time. It's going up really quickly, so I'm assuming we should leave it a minute. Responses are slowing. Lauren, I will leave it to you to determine when the responses have slowed to the point where we can just take the poll.
I would say they're probably slowed enough there.
Yeah, me too. Okay, right. Do we see the poll results? Let me have a look. I can't see them. There we go. Right. While I wait for somebody to tell me how to see the results, because I've obviously forgotten how to do that.
I can see them, so I can tell you that about
okay,
93% of people said yes.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we've got a few people to explain a bit more to. So bear with me while I just flick out of there and back onto my notes. Okay, then. So we'll move on, and I'm going to hand over to the people who really know much more about this project. So, Teresa, I think you're going to start by giving us an overview of the research programme.
Yep, absolutely, I can do that. So as Jenny mentioned, the project is called Diversity and Productivity, from Education to Work. So it's really around the idea of how can we unlock the untapped potential of diverse people and increase productivity. And to do this, we kind of take a life cycle approach to productivity and diversity. And that means that we start at education and we move on throughout someone's career. So things like, are there obstacles for people to access different courses at university? What are the types of career paths that people follow when regards to diversity, and how does that impact the productivity? And then when we come to the workforce, when we come to firms, what is the relationship between diversity, inclusion, and productivity that's determining people's careers and their outcomes? I'm really excited about this project because it's also, as kind of you mentioned, it's multidisciplinary. So we have people from different backgrounds working on this together. We have sociologists, economics people, psychologists, and behavioral scientists. And we also have different institutions coming together to kind of look at this issue. So today we are all from the LSE, and the part of the project that we're really focusing on is this idea in firms of the relationship between diversity, productivity, and also inclusion. But there's other researchers from UCL, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, from Sheffield, and from Warwick, which are looking at some of the other questions. And the project started about a year ago, so we have some initial results that we are very happy to share with you. And I think, Jasmine, your project is probably the one that has the most interesting results. So if you could talk to us about that, that'd be amazing.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm currently leading the qualitative aspect, as Teresa said, of what does it mean for us to understand productivity in the workforce across diverse individuals. And I think one thing that's really important when we're doing this kind of research is understanding what good practice is, particularly with qualitative research. You'll often see in academic work that studies are often quite limited in their sample size, so between 15 to 30 people. But this study, we're actually interviewing 200 people across various sectors, so banking and finance, professional services, technology, retail, and some public services, as well as interviewing participants who are across different levels of seniority. So some of those, they're really early on in their careers, so some of those sat in the C-suite. Because it's really important to understand the different types of how we conceptualize productivity and what that means in terms of the roles that people have. In terms of those 200 people, we are interviewing people across demographic groups that have typically either underrepresented across all of these sectors or have traditionally had lower outcomes on the labour market, lower outcomes and trajectories on the labour market in terms of their pay and promotion. So this includes Asian women and Black women, those who have been diagnosed with mental health conditions, maybe disabled, blind, or partially sighted, as well as those who are neurodiverse, gender fluid, or trans. And across white men and women, we are stratifying by socioeconomic status. we do have some preliminary findings, which I will share with you, but I think it's really important to think about, as I said, good practice. So one that I've highlighted is the sample size, but also the intersectionality. As I've just mentioned, these different types of demographic groups. We also give our participants the option to self-declare or describe aspects of the diversity that are typically missing, because we know that research typically focuses on gender, race, and some of the other key aspects. But it's really important to give, especially when you're conducting research, to be able to give people the opportunity to self-describe. And I think that is what takes us further when we're understanding what intersectionality means for individuals. Also in terms of the depth of the interviews, I think is really important. So the questions that we're asking, we ask people to define what productivity means to them. And often people have a definition that applies to their work life and to their personal lives, or it's sometimes an amalgamation of the two. We ask them if that aligns with the expectation or the description of productivity from their employer, to see whether there are mismatches there across certain groups, as well as asking them to describe a time in their career where they felt that they were really highly productive, or the opposite, where they weren't that productive, so we can get an understanding of what contributing factors to this impact people's productivity and how they conceptualize that. How does it make them feel? Are people more motivated when they're in certain environments, or are they able to perform better when they're surrounded by different types of people, and what other enabling factors there are within organizations? As well as understanding what kind of support people need. And this varies across different people and different groups, but really getting an understanding of what kind of support enables people to be more productive, or who has had a lack of support across their career, and what does that mean in terms of their pay and their promotions. We also ask them to identify someone else who they think is really highly productive, and that gives us an insight again as to how people conceptualize productivity and whether there are certain either behavioral traits or actions that people associate with productivity in professional contexts. And one of our last questions is to ask people what advice they would give to someone starting out in their career at the same point, to understand. I think people are often very self-reflective, so understanding, okay, maybe I didn't necessarily do this in the right way at this time in my career, but being able to reflect on that, they give us really good answers as to what they would suggest for people coming through in those pipelines. And in terms of some of our preliminary findings at the moment, they actually align with some of the work that Teresa, Daniel and I have done over the last year in terms of the reorganisation of work post-pandemic and what that means. And across all of our demographic groups, people are really trying to get an understanding of what does autonomy look like in a post-COVID era and how impactful that is for productivity. This isn't particular to one group. Most people, I'd say the majority of people, enjoy the autonomy in their work. It allows them to be productive in ways, whether that's related to their environment, working from home in a hybrid manner or in the office. But particularly for some groups, so those who are disabled or neurodiverse, job crafting has come up particularly in terms of allowing people to be productive in a way that aligns with their interests and their skills. I think there are often stereotypes, particularly those associated with those who are neurodiverse or disabled, in terms of capabilities. And we know as behavioural science researchers that these don't stand to be true. And actually, there is work to be done across professional workplaces to break down these stereotypes. For those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, for example, there is this theme of not necessarily knowing the unwritten rules of professional workplaces and what that means in terms of networking. So there's definitely work to be done in terms of making sure that everyone has access to the same types of resources, either within the organisation, or actually we found that people often seek mentorship outside of their own organisation because it can give them, it introduces them to these networks and allows them to understand different perspectives, especially if they're thinking of career progression and promotion. For some of the trans individuals that we've spoken to, being misgendered in the workplace has a significant impact on their mental health, and that directly impacts productivity. So ensuring that organizations have a clear strategy of a way of informing and educating their workforce on gender fluid and trans identities in the workplace is extremely important. And research has actually shown that between I think around 14% of 16 to 18-year-olds at the moment do not identify as male or female. So these people are either non-binary or gender fluid. And I think that will have an impact in terms of people going into the workforce. As Teresa said, we're looking at aspects, some of our colleagues are looking at the aspects on the education side, and we're focused on the workplace side. But this is something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. For individuals who are blind, and I think this is really important, there has been a lack of people being provided with the softwares that they need to be able to do their jobs. And I've often found from some of the participants I've spoken to, these are individuals who are working in charitable organizations that focus on disability or focus on blindness. And the fact that they haven't been provided with the tools that they need to be able to do their job is honestly quite astounding. So I think we need to think about really in terms of what we're providing employees and understanding that these types of things are necessary. So having stereotypes and biases that people aren't capable of doing certain jobs isn't true. It's actually, we need to know what we can provide them with to enable them better to be productive. And as I said, this study is still ongoing, so we're almost at the 3/4 mark of our data collection, and hoping in the new year to have published findings and a framework that will that organisations can take on board to implement the actions that we suggest that will maximise their diversity and enable productivity of all employees. So I'll hand back to you, Jenny.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Jasmine. Sorry, it's really interesting, and I'm taking notes because I am going to do a write-up of this afterwards. I do that. This is it's really essential to really understand the nuances of those individual experiences, and particularly of underrepresented talent. So I think that's what a lot of the audience are going to be interested in then, in terms of how do we track and measure that, which Daniel, I think we're going to come over to you because you've got experience of interventions that can be used to increase diversity in recruitment. And so if you can tell us a little bit about them, that would be really good. Thank you.
Yeah, happily. Thank you, Jenny. So I think one of the questions is just coming back to this question of, well, what makes diversity important? I was really interested to see the poll, which we did earlier, and we saw this overwhelming response to people recognising diversity, equality and inclusion as being good for productivity. So when we talk about just getting that diversity into our organisations, what is the reason? What is it that people think is making this an important exercise? And I think it kind of boils down to two things. So one is the kind of moral case for diversity. I think we all instinctively feel that we want to give everyone the opportunity, and we want to work in organisations where there's good representation. And I think when we don't, there's a feeling of unease potentially, and we recognise that perhaps we're privileging certain groups or we're underrepresented in others. And I think that that doesn't always sit well. So I think that moral case for diversity is important. But I think more and more we're talking about this business case for diversity. So we're kind of saying, okay, well, if we get enough people together and they come from different backgrounds, then they're all going to bring their unique and interesting perspectives, and then we'll bring them together, and that is going to help us be more innovative, creative, or to look at problems in different ways. And as behavioural scientists, we kind of see this through a lens of two things. When we have diverse representation, we have higher human capital. And when I talk about human capital, I'm talking about the skills, the experiences, the knowledge that individuals bring to the team. But we also have higher social capital, and that's often the networks or the understanding. So for example, if you're a business and you're looking to expand your client base, bringing someone in who has different client networks and can perhaps open you up to new customers, that's social capital, and diversity is important for that. And as a blend, you know, if we're creating products or we're creating services for a specific population and that population is not represented in our workforce, then how are we really going to understand and hit the mark of those customers or clients or that public that we're serving? So they're the two things that I think make diversity important, this moral case and this business case. But then when it comes to getting in the door, I think there's really two things. And the first is understanding the diversity that you have. And I think as organizations, we often do a really poor job of this. And that is just simply looking at the people who work for us along different dimensions of diversity and saying, well, what does the representation look like here? And it's not enough just to do that. We also need to compare it to something relevant outside. Diversity to a company where the work is based on site in, say, in Sweden is going to be very different to diversity where the work is remote and the headquarters is in New York. So in a lot of ways, we kind of have to look at, well, what is the expected diversity that we should have in our organization based on the way that we operate? And I think that can also raise some really difficult questions. For example, if we want people just from London, are we potentially going to exclude populations from further afield? Is that going to have a socio-economic consequence if we're asking people to come into the office in central London every day? What's that going to mean? How does that impact potentially our representation of older adults or working parents if we don't have flexible work in place? So really understanding some of that is quite important. And then the next thing is being a bit more reflective about our hiring practices. So actually looking at, well, who's applying for the jobs that we put out there, and how does that marry with who gets hired? Is our lack of diversity in the areas which we're seeking it is because we're not getting the applicants, or is it because we're getting the applicants and actually something happens through our pipeline with these applications that means that we're not hiring those candidates? So the second thing is really the diversity that we want. And I think this is really, this is often simpler than what we make it out to be. I'm a really big fan of being transparent about underrepresentation. So if we look in our organisation and we see that we're underrepresented in certain areas, I think making that known to potential applicants is really important, because then we're being honest. We're saying, actually, we've looked at our organisation, we can see that we're underrepresented in these areas, we'd like to correct it, and we're encouraging people from these areas to have a conversation with us or to apply. It also might be worth understanding the reasons for that. I spoke a little bit about flexibility. Jasmine also spoke about it. Is it that we don't have the mechanisms in place to support those people, and do we need to change that, as well as being transparent about who we want to bring in? And then after that, there's lots of behavioural science interventions that can boost diversity, but unfortunately not all of them translate seamlessly from the lab into the real world, and there's a bit of a test and learn that's needed, and it also varies across different dimensions of diversity. What's going to work to increase gender diversity in an organisation might be very different to increasing age diversity in an organisation, and it also might depend which aspects of gender or which areas of age are actually underrepresented, because that's going to vary from organisation to organisation. So I think once we understand the diversity that we have and the diversity we want, we also need to make sure that we're able to keep and manage that diversity and get the productivity benefits from that. And I think Teresa's probably best placed to talk to that.
Yep, I think hand over to Teresa, so about how we can use behavioural science to really understand the link between inclusion and performance.
Sounds good. So I really like the fact that Daniel's been talking about diversity into organizations, but I think anyone who's kind of in the D&I space has heard the problem of inclusion, right? So it's not just around how do we get these people in the door, but what do we do with them? How are we making sure that human capital and social capital that Daniel's mentioned is actually being tapped in? And our work here as part of the project is something I'm really passionate about, because it doesn't just look at individuals, but actually looks at their interactions in a team. And something else that we've spoken a lot about, and actually the poll brought up, is that we had about 90% of people, which I know is probably not representative of the population, because if you're here, you're probably interested in diversity to begin with. But let's say that there's 90% of people who are kind of convinced about this idea of diversity relates to productivity and inclusion is important. Intentions are great, but do we actually know what drives behavioral change? And I think here there's a huge gap, right? I don't think I can tell you with 100% accuracy, I know what I do in every interaction that is making sure that people are being included. And something that we've been looking a lot about is, okay, so we want to increase inclusion. What aspects of inclusion can actually drive behavioral change? And inclusion, the definition academically is this idea that you need to increase someone's belongingness. So they must be like, if they're part of a group, they're part of the organization, they feel part of the overall construct they're in, but they also must be valued for their uniqueness. So if I'm I'm going to take the idea, if I'm an engineer and everyone else in my team is a psychologist, I am not, by the way, but I could be, having myself be valued as an engineer will be very important to me. And without that, I can't contribute to the unique ideas I have of an engineer within the psychology kind of background. So there's this tension here between uniqueness and belonging that arises from the literature. And the work that we're trying to do now as part of this project is really testing out what elements of this are more important for a team to be more productive. And we're defining productivity in you can define it in a broad way or a specific way. We're taking an experimental approach, and that means that we're bringing people together into kind of like a virtual lab where we're having professional individuals work together in a team, and we're defining productivity in this sense as how creative they are, because we know creativity is very important for the productivity of overall teams. So what we're trying to do is really testing out these different parts of inclusion. So as a couple of examples, we can think about, if we're all in a team meeting, is it important that we all speak the exact same amount of time? Is that what's going to make sure that everyone is included? Or is it, for example, how we resolve tension? So we know that for innovation, creativity to happen, people need to bring in interesting and new ideas. But sometimes to bring those ideas, I need to disagree with someone else. Resolving that tension, resolving that conflict is hugely important for creativity. So how can we make sure that inclusion kind of benefits that? So the work that we're doing, and Daniel and I have been working on this for about 6 months, but unfortunately we don't have results yet, is really testing out these things that we can do within teams to understand if they improve the inclusion levels of diverse teams. And our first stage, as I've mentioned, is bringing professionals into our online lab that we're testing it out. And then the second stage, which I think will be really, really interesting, is now we give it back to organizations. We bring it back to the workplace and say, this is the stuff that we found. Can you now go and test it? And I think this is really crucial, because a lot of the time when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we think about organizational level change, right? So we need the right policies in place. We need to have this top-down approach of, are we having the right trainings? Is everyone speaking the same language? And these things are really important. But I think there's an element of that's easier for everyone to test, which is, all right, so about my team, or about my team meeting, how can I be experimenting at that level that doesn't require, everyone in an organization to come together, to see if there's something that I can do that drives changes there, measure that, and then iterate. And I think this is where the behavioral science kind of methodology, more than anything else, can be super, super helpful, because it talks through that, right? So I have an idea, I have a hypothesis. Let's say in this case is I'm going to always pick on someone who doesn't really speak and say, hey, do you have an idea beforehand that you want to write down? And then you can bring it to the meeting. This is just an example. I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to measure the outcome, and then maybe 6 months later, I'm going to try something else. So this idea that whatever you decide to implement doesn't have to be fixed is something that needs to be tested, needs to be improved, needs to be iterated, I think is really powerful. And it's actually really helpful in not saying, hey, we went down a wrong direction and now we need to pivot again. Actually, it's all about learning and improving and testing. So hopefully that is what I think behavioral science can bring into this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think for people listening, just while people are putting in their questions, there's a few things I sort of wanted to pick up on and just to think about. I think in terms of people listening, and we're predominantly, I think, we're mainly policy professionals, analysts, etc. And we're quite often in really big departments and some of our agencies. And my experience of doing EDI work as a policy person and as an HR person is that we just don't make the most of the talent and the expertise that we can access in our own departments. We have behavioural scientists in government departments. We have really good analysts and social researchers. We have people who are focused on external facing equalities type policies. They might be looking at social disadvantage. This isn't going to be a question, by the way, I'm just making a comment. It would be the worst waffly question ever. But something I'm really excited about this project is the potential for it to be applied and to change the way we think about EDI in the civil service. And I know that people in Cabinet Office are interested in talking to the project around the work and how it can help us understand inclusion at work in terms of the things that have come out of reports like Inclusive Britain, which is looking at ethnic diversity in the workplace. And I've also talked to Cabinet Office about how we have like this massive pool of people, so many teams trying to do EDI work, and actually the type of productivity you're talking about in terms of creation and innovation and doing things which really add value to the public, and sometimes it might actually have a financial value to it as well, are really, really relevant to the civil service. And I'm really hoping as the project develops that actually those findings, we can take them up. There were a couple of things that sort of occurred to me, but I think it's, rather than me starting by asking my many questions I could probably ask for about half an hour, Lauren, is it all right if I hand over to you and we can bring in some people? I would suggest that we probably don't try, because we're on a slightly different platform, so we can't see people if they ask questions. So Lauren will read out your questions. Lauren, do you want to give us some to get going with?
Yeah, thanks. So thank you so much for everyone who submitted a question. I'm going to just sort of do them in order of how many upvotes they've got. So we've got the most popular ones top. So the first one is Rachel has commented that in her experience, the civil service is very good at talking the talk on diversity at sort of personnel and policy level, but not so good at walking the walk. Experience can be very dependent on the sort of manager and policy lead. Is this the panel's experience? Do they have any further thoughts on that?
Who would like to take that one? I would agree. There's a lot of talk in the talk.
I think, I think because we're taking a broad view and we're working with a lot of different organisations, I'm not sure that we necessarily would say, well, this is what's happening in government as distinct from others. But what I would say is that I think that the talking the talk is not such a bad thing. I think a lot of people are bringing good intentions to these initiatives and to creating diversity. I'd say it's really difficult, and it's there are a lot of changes that need to be made, and it's a lot of work. So I think talking the talk is a good first step. But I think, as Teresa and Jasmine said, there are a lot of different considerations that go into creating diversity and inclusion. And even for us, I think we're constantly, as researchers, we're also trying to learn what works. And I think that involves a certain amount of sometimes not getting it right in order to get to where we want to go. Don't know, Teresa, Jasmine, if you have comment on that.
I think you're absolutely right in the sense that I don't think this is a specific issue within the civil service. We've kind of heard this throughout, and some of the other work we do at the Inclusion Initiative has identified barriers for specific groups. Jasmine, you can probably talk about this a lot better than I can. And this idea that your team manager or the person who's in charge is kind of the gatekeeper and the person that matters a lot when it comes to implementing those things within the team is really important. But I would say that I would separate them into two things. One is, when you see something that is a huge problem for diversity, for example, and this is something that I think it's really important that we address immediately, because it's going to turn people away. It's going to create an environment in which people don't feel safe, don't feel secure. And I think that at that stage, talking the talk is definitely not enough. We need to act almost immediately. I think the other side is some of the things that we've been talking about. So how do we make teams more inclusive within how they communicate with each other? And I hope here that this idea of experimentation of, right, we've been talking about this for a while, let's try something. Let's try something that has a relatively low risk, because it's just about how we as a team manage each other. And let's see if that improves things. I'm hoping that through the idea of behavioral science, of testing, iterating, and measuring, even if it is just something like, hey, how do you feel at the end of the week, and seeing if that's changed a little bit from before you started this experimentation, could be something that allows individuals, teams, and then organizations to move from this talking the talk to walking the walk.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, next question. So the next two I'm going to sort of take together because they are sort of covering the same sort of area. So thank you to Kerry and Mark for these questions. So Kerry says that a chunk of the media and politicians are vocal about civil service being, in quotations, too woke and focusing on diversity too much. How do we persuade them of the arguments that it is good for productivity as well as just being a good thing in itself? And Mark sort of on a similar track has said that the least diverse part of the civil service is the senior civil service. How receptive are our leaders to new approaches and the business case for diversity? So sort of questions about how we make the senior leaders in the civil service really buy into this initiative.
I think in terms of the too woke, people in organisations, and perhaps particularly in the civil service, need to assess the populations that they are serving. I think it may seem that there is something that is too woke, but actually if we look at the populations of people in the UK, and the issues that we know that some of them face, whether this be in social aspects of their life or access to resources or in the workforce, we need to understand that the reason that it may seem that we are focusing on this really highly is because there has been a considerable lack of this before in terms of the considerations of diversity and the impact that this has on people. So it may actually be sort of a timeline type of thing. Actually, we've not talked about it for so long necessarily that now in the past 5-10 years it seems that we are talking about it even more, but it's actually it's for a reason and there is a purpose to it. In terms of the senior leadership, I think at the Inclusion Initiative we've focused on what it means to be an inclusive leader, and I think in some aspects understanding that there are certain traits perhaps that inclusive leaders can adopt in terms of their understanding of how initiatives are rolled out, what this means for the work and how they create their teams is particularly important when we're thinking about diversity as well. Lauren, I'm not sure if I missed the second part of the question.
The second part was they were fairly similar. They were just about obviously the least diverse part of civil service being the senior civil service, and how receptive are the leaders to new approaches and the business case for diversity.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Jenny.
No, all I was going to say actually is that I think it's really important if people come across this is to point people as well to the fact that civil service has a D&I strategy approved by ministers, and some of the language that you hear used out in the media and when you hear soundbites from politicians, to take that kind of policy scepticism to some of that you might, lots of other things that they say, whether they're completely not about EDI at all, because we have a strategy. And I think the important thing about this kind of way of thinking about it is it's not doing this just as a standalone activity. It's doing it because it actually helps develop better policy, better implementing the policies they want us to deliver for them better. So that kind of link in and how you measure it is really, really important in the civil service, because actually too often EDI stands alone, and whilst that has an important element, don't get me wrong, it's much harder to argue with against something that's going to put in place government policies like they want to see. Makes for more creative, innovative teams. So, Lauren, should we take another one?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm just going to jump in with a a slightly more practical one, because plenty of people in the chat are asking about when the report might be shared or how they can sign up to follow progress and outcomes. So if someone doesn't mind jumping in on that point, and then we can go back to the more sort of substantive questions.
Yeah, there's so diversityandproductivity.com is our website, so you'll get more details about the whole body of work across various institutes there. And you can also sign up to the Inclusion Initiative mailing list, where we share a lot of our events, our publications, and our thought leadership pieces. I'm hoping that the report will come out in the new year. So we're still collecting data, as I said. We need to go through the data analysis process, but this report will be specific to the qualitative aspect that I mentioned. But if you sign up to the Inclusion Initiative mailing list, the report will be sent out via the list. It will be freely available online as well.
Yeah, we'll make sure everybody who signed up for this gets access to the links, and we'll be sending out a number of links actually. And in my write-up, I'll make sure that's included as well.
Amazing, thanks. Okay, so the next question is another one from Rachel, and she's just said that while the argument of improved diversity leading to greater productivity is generally true and very important, having a chronic or recurring condition does not always make individuals really productive. Is there a risk that the focus on productivity could imply that disabled or otherwise diverse people are only valuable when they are productive? And there's there's a quick reply to that one as well, that's basically talking about the specific terms like creativity and innovation, and their sort of level of inclusiveness. Sorry, Teresa.
No, that's, I think that was it. That was a great point. I think I probably can answer about half of it, and I'm hoping Jasmine, with the insight that she's got from the interviews, can contribute to that as well. I think it's important to say that when we talked about productivity, we talk about untapped productivity. So that's kind of what the research is also telling us, is that a lot of the time when we talk about disability, we say that people can't do something, when actually a lot of the time the barriers are not something that people can't do, but it's actually how does the system and how are they enabled to actually contribute to the way that they can. And that part, we are not good in terms of workplace, no matter where you're working at. If you look at the gaps with disability in terms of labor force participation, they're the biggest ones. And if you look at all of the research behind that, it talks to the fact that it's not about someone's ability, but it's actually the barriers to them participating fullest to the way that they can. And then I think with regards to creativity and productivity, there is an element there, absolutely. I think the ways in which we're familiar with the term creativity, and when we think about it, I think when we say creativity, a lot of the time people think it's Steve Jobs, coming up with some great ideas that are going to change the world, and that's not what creativity is. A lot of the time is around, the way we're measuring creativity is around the number of unique ideas that teams can have and the novelty of those ideas. And I think talking about it in that sense really helps identify that what we're saying is, for you to come up with something good, it doesn't have to be the best thing or the newest thing ever. It just is around what is unique and how can you look at something from a unique perspective, for example. And that's what's going to make incremental creativity really good for organizations or to solve solutions. So maybe I should have explained that to begin with, our definition of creativity. So I think, Jasmine, do you have anything to add on disability?
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely covered it. So the interviews, we're trying to get an understanding of what helps and hinders productivity. And as Teresa mentioned, there are barriers in place across all workforces that prevent people who are disabled or neurodiverse, for example, or any aspects of diversity from participating in a way fully. And again, this is related to the stereotypes or the norms that we've held previously in the workplace as what does it mean to be productive? What does it mean to be creative or innovative? And actually understanding people's experiences with these in-depth interviews helps us understand the solutions that we can suggest to organizations as well. So we're really grateful that people share their lived experience with us, not just personally, but professionally. And I think in terms of, as I said, what we define as productive is particularly important. And this is why we ask all of our participants what productivity means to them, and how this aligns or does not align with the expectations of their employer, because people may be environments they'd like to succeed or to be promoted and work within particular environments that actually prevent that from happening to them. I think, Lauren, there was a second part to your question again. Apologies, I keep forgetting.
No, it's fine. So there was just a sort of response on that about the terms like creativity and innovation. Teresa, I know you sort of touched on that, and whether they can be more sort of specific or inclusive. But just about the terminology used, basically.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, Lenny.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the challenges is productivity. I think as Jasmine's measuring really nicely, it means something different to all of us, and that can be dependent on our role. It can be dependent on how we think our role should be done well. So I think one of the things that our team is able to do is we're able to hold a number of different definitions of productivity simultaneously and then mobilize them to test them in different ways. And the way that we might talk about productivity when we're interviewing is different to the way that we might use it in an experiment, and it's different to the way that we might use it when we're looking at kind of broad economic data. And I think that we can all appreciate that, in the civil service, what it means to be productive is going to be a very different measure than what it might be for someone working in a bank or for someone working in a startup. So I think productivity in general, it can be quite unique. And I think understanding those measures and the breadth of those measures is kind of an important step in tackling it.
Brilliant, thanks guys. So the next question is around return to office, and Alan has put, I wonder if you are studying any of the large corporations that are currently mandating return to office. He puts, I know it's having a personal impact on lots of people, but a lot of companies seem to be assuming that going back into the office will improve productivity.
So from the qualitative research that I'm currently conducting and a large-scale qualitative study from last year, this did involve a lot of the big banks and consultancy firms that were mandating the return to the office. And quite frankly, a lot of people just didn't engage with it because even though it was mandated, a lot of firms weren't enforcing it. And actually, most of the people made the case that we are still being productive. We are still having the output that we need, that's expected of us. And in some cases, people were performing beyond expectations, partly because they were able to structure their working days or their weeks in a way that aligned with what helped them be productive and, their personal lives as well. I think everyone post-pandemic has had a reevaluation of their values and how work fits into that in terms of their personal life. And people have been enabled to attend to aspects of their mental health, their physical health, their well-being generally, alongside their work in a way that we weren't able to before the pandemic happened. As well as the fact that the only thing I would mention actually is that some people raised aspects of what we were defining as creativity, or the communication aspect of working within teams, is something that some people struggled with. So teams have been prioritizing, whether this be weekly, bi-monthly, or on a monthly basis, having time where employees are expected to be in the office for the purposes of that creative problem solving. And there is something around that we haven't quite been able to articulate yet, that everyone says that there is something missing when you're not in the room with some people. And I think ensuring that it is having those requirements in a way that is inclusive, that people are given enough time beforehand to prepare or to plan, if this means, like Daniel said, working parents, perhaps those with accessibility needs, or maybe traveling into work from further away, will enable people to really actually understand the value of being able to have those moments where people are together in the office. But actually, if people are performing and they're working in a hybrid manner, I think we should continue to let them do so.
Lovely, thank you. Jenny, do you want to keep going?
That we've got time for a few more. We'll try and finish at 5:02, and we want to just rerun the poll. Although I think we probably know what that's going to say, but yeah, probably got time for one or two more.
Lovely. Okay, so the next one is from Ben, and this one's sort of a more practical question. So he's asking, or he's really interested to hear about the tangible steps that civil servants can perform to take D&I into consideration during policy creation and delivery. And is there sort of any ways to meaningfully track or measure a decision or action through the lens of improving diversity and inclusion? So any comments on that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of measuring, I think it's really the first step. So I think year on year you can look at the diversity that you have in the organisation. What I would say is that often when organisations are measuring diversity, they're only doing so along two dimensions, which is gender and race, ethnicity. So I would really encourage a little bit of an expansion of that, particularly here in the UK. I think one of the great things about this project is we're looking at socioeconomic status, which we believe here in the UK, we think that there might be some real issues in and around that. I'm personally very interested in age, and I know that there's a bit of a push to get older workers back into the workforce. So there are other dimensions that can be used. I also think it's important to look at the representation across different levels of seniority. We spoke, someone wrote in the comments that they didn't feel that their leadership was necessarily representative of the diversity in the organisation. So I think that that's really important. I think sometimes organisations can say, oh yes, we're very diverse, but all that diversity is perhaps on the front lines of their business. So it's really important to look at that. And then I think looking at those things year on year and looking at different interventions. So I think looking at it in who the organisation is hiring, but also who the organisation is retaining. If everyone is leaving as soon as they become a parent in the organisation, for example, that points to a potential problem that can be addressed with better policies for parents in the organisation, as an example. Teresa, I'm not sure if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I really, with regards to the decisions being made, something that I think we've really pushed for in the inclusion initiative is that, as Daniel mentioned, transparency and measuring are key. But actually, it also matters when you're measuring. So a lot of the time, for example, when it gets to promotions, by the time you're measuring promotion decisions, there's been 10 to 20 to 1,000 factors that have gone into who got promoted. And really just saying, hey, we're not promoting the right people is really hard to disentangle. So trying to figure out what's the criteria that is leading to those promotions and understanding where the gaps are, I think is kind of a practical way where we can do this. And for example, at the Inclusion Initiative, we really focus on the idea of who's being given opportunities. So, okay, we've measured who's on what project, but do we measure who's been offered to be on what project? Do we understand who's on what steering committee? Do we understand on who's being part of what network? I think measuring those aspects that then kind of funnel in to these important moments of recruitment, retention, promotion are really, really key.
Right, I think we will have to finish off there. If there's other really important questions we haven't got to, we'll have a look at those afterwards, and I'll try and I'll talk to colleagues over in the Inclusion Initiative and see what we can do in terms of coming back to you. I'm not going to ask them to promise to answer all the other questions, but we will definitely look at them. And just to sort of draw this together, really, I think that point that you're just making at the end is really important when it comes to EDI in the civil service. There is a tendency there's quite a lot of activity that goes on, and some of that has been you see claims made for how it of an impact that's making, but actually when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to people being promoted, etc., that disentangling what's happening and why and how we can actually sort of evaluate that is really critical. So there's a few things I will take away from this, and a few things to mention. So firstly, we have got our big focus here on data and how you use data. And I think everybody who wants to be involved in this kind of work, getting that good relationship with your researchers and analysts and your behavioural scientists, your psychologists, we have them all and economists in big government departments, maybe lesser so in some of the smaller ones, but certainly in the big departments. And we've got a policy profession data report coming out in the autumn as well. I think that intersectional challenge is really is a challenge for us in the civil service. We have lots of data, but it's all generally cut in quite a sort of two-dimensional way. And looking beyond that is the next big step for us. I think there's something really important you said about how we talk about productivity and creativity. They are words we use in the civil service. We talk about that innovation and actually thinking about what that means in the policy profession and how we do policy for the people in the teams themselves, but also how we translate that into the policy process. But I wanted to finish really by just saying that actually anybody who's interested in policy and who either works with policy people or is a policy person, really our day job are very much about deconstructing things, asking difficult questions, thinking about these things. And actually we need to apply that kind of thinking and those kind of questions to this challenge. And I think what today has really given me is a real insight into the opportunities we have actually sort of within our profession to do this and to do it better. So a huge great thank you to our panel from the Inclusion Initiative, and thank you very much for everybody who came to listen. We're just going to rerun the poll just because it's a nice thing to do at the end, and hopefully we haven't seen a big drop, but I've probably now biased the poll, so we probably could. But anyway, if we could rerun the poll and just see to where we go, where we end up. Oh yeah, I can see that now. So it is going up and that one's going down a bit. So that's good. That's good. And I think this is going to be a journey for people. Some of this is going to be very familiar. Other things about how we measure is going to be actually when some of these findings and reports come out, I think people will look at them with great interest. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody for coming. We will send around some information afterwards. I'm not exactly sure how I will do that, but I will make sure it does happen in terms of getting you links, etc. And we can do that. It's been really good to talk about this as part of our policy festival. It is also the first day of National Inclusion Week this week, so it's been really, really well timed. And so actually keep an eye on the Policy Profession website, because we've got some other things for National Inclusion Week this week too. So thank you, everybody. I think we'll leave it there, and you've got, well, maybe 2 minutes until you might have another meeting, but hopefully you've enjoyed it, and thank you very much for coming.